Welcome to Betrayed Hearts Chronicles. The summer sun had started to dip, casting long shadows across our quiet suburban street. The annual neighborhood barbecue was in full swing, and I was doing what I always did, standing on the sidelines, sipping my wine, and smiling politely. Michael was off with the other husbands, deep in some debate about stocks or football. It was like watching strangers perform a play I'd seen 1,000 times before. That's when I noticed him. He was leaning casually against the fence, a beer in hand, chatting with one of the older couples. He wasn't from here. That much was obvious. He looked too relaxed, his button-down shirt rolled up at the sleeves, revealing tanned forearms. His hair was slightly tousled, as if he hadn't bothered with a comb, and his smile. There was something about it. Easy. Magnetic. Emma, have you met Caleb yet? Marcy's voice jolted me from my thoughts. She was the unofficial queen of the neighborhood, always in everyone's business. She grabbed my arm and dragged me toward him. Caleb just moved into the old Peterson place, she chirped, thrusting me into the spotlight. Hi! I extended my hand, suddenly hyper-aware of the soft floral scent of my lotion. Caleb's grip was firm but warm, his touch lingering just a second too long. Nice to meet you, Emma. His voice was smooth, with a hint of something playful. I think I've seen you around. You're the one with the rose bushes out front, right? Yes. I mean, they're a little overgrown, but they're beautiful, he interrupted, his eyes holding mine. They caught my eye the first day I moved in. A rush of heat crept up my neck, and I quickly looked away, laughing nervously. What brings you to our little corner of suburbia? I asked, desperate to keep the conversation light. A fresh start, he said simply. There was a shadow behind his smile, a story he wasn't telling. I needed a change, and this place seemed perfect. Perfect. It was anything but, I thought, glancing at Michael, who was now checking his watch. Marcy, oblivious to the undercurrent, clapped her hands. Well, you'll love it here. And Emma can give you all the tips on gardening. Can't you, dear? Oh, I'm hardly an expert, I said, forcing a laugh. Nonsense. I'll have to pick your brain, Caleb said, his gaze still locked on me. The conversation drifted as Marcy pulled Caleb into introductions with another neighbor. But for the rest of the evening, I felt his presence, like a silent thread pulling at the edges of my attention. Later that night, after the dishes were cleared and the kids were asleep, Michael sat on the couch, scrolling through his phone. I wandered to the kitchen, restless. I could still hear Caleb's voice, feel the weight of his gaze. I told myself it was nothing, just a harmless meeting, the kind of thing that happens at every neighborhood barbecue. But as I stood by the window, staring out at the house next door, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, something I couldn't quite name. The next few days were uneventful, a return to the usual rhythm of life. Michael was up and out early, immersed in his work, while I spent my time managing the house and ferrying the kids to their activities. But no matter how much I tried to distract myself, I couldn't shake the memory of Caleb from the barbecue. The way his eyes had lingered on me just a little too long, the warmth of his handshake. I told myself it was ridiculous. He was just a neighbor. Yet, every time I passed by the window, my gaze drifted toward his house. It was a Wednesday morning when I saw him again. The kids had just left for school, and I was outside tending to the rose bushes. I had pulled on a wide-brimmed hat and gloves, determined to tackle the overgrown mess. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of freshly cut grass, when I heard his voice. Those roses are even more beautiful up close. I turned sharply, my heart skipping a beat. Caleb stood on the sidewalk, hands in his pockets, his relaxed posture at odds with the slight smirk on his face. Oh, thanks, I stammered, suddenly self-conscious in my garden gloves and old jeans. He took a step closer, glancing at the blooms. You've got a good eye for this. I'd probably kill them in a week. I doubt that, I said, trying to keep my tone light. He tilted his head, studying me for a moment. I mean it, though. They're impressive. You must spend a lot of time out here. It's peaceful, I admitted, Gives me something to do. He smiled, and for a moment, the air between us felt heavy, charged with something unspoken. The days that followed saw Caleb popping up more often. He waved when I checked the mail, stopped to chat when I was out for a walk, and once even knocked on the door to ask if I had any sugar. Sugar? I had laughed nervously, handing him a small bag. For coffee, he explained, his grin easy. I'm still unpacking. Thought I had some, but apparently not. His excuses felt flimsy, but I didn't question them. Part of me liked the attention. Michael, as usual, was too busy to notice anything out of the ordinary. The first real crack came on a Saturday afternoon. Michael had taken the kids to a soccer game, and I was folding laundry in the living room when the doorbell rang. I opened it to find Caleb standing there, holding a small box of tools. "Hey," he said, his smile warm. "I hate to bother you, but do you have a drill I could borrow? Mine's still packed away somewhere." I hesitated. Sure. Let me grab it." I retrieved the drill from the garage and handed it to him. As I did, his fingers brushed mine, lingering just a moment too long. I felt a jolt, an almost electric spark that made me pull my hand back quickly. "Thanks," he said, his voice low. His eyes met mine, and for a second, I forgot how to breathe. "It's no problem," I managed to say, stepping back inside and closing the door a little too quickly. I leaned against it, heart racing, a mix of guilt and exhilaration flooding me. That night, I sat at the dinner table with Michael and the kids, feeling Caleb's presence like a ghost. Michael was recounting a story from work, but I wasn't listening. My mind kept replaying that touch, the way his eyes had lingered. "Emma?" Michael's voice pulled me back to reality. "Sorry, what?" I asked if you're feeling okay. "You seem distracted." I forced a smile. "I'm fine. Just tired, that's all." He nodded, seemingly satisfied, but I could see the faint crease of concern on his forehead. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I told myself it was nothing. Just a touch. Just a neighbor borrowing a drill. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. Something was shifting, and I wasn't sure I could stop it. The morning was cool for summer, with gray clouds hinting at rain. I decided to head to the grocery store early, hoping to beat the usual weekend rush. Shopping was a mindless chore, something to fill the hours while Michael worked his weekend overtime. I was halfway through the aisles, debating between two brands of pasta, when I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Do you always put this much thought into pasta?" I turned to see Caleb standing there, holding a basket filled with fresh produce and a loaf of artisan bread. He was dressed casually in a fitted navy t-shirt and jeans, but somehow he managed to look effortlessly put together. I laughed, feeling a rush of warmth. Some decisions require careful consideration. "Well, if you need a second opinion, I'm your guy." He gestured to my half-full cart. "Looks like you're planning something good." "Just the usual. Feeding the family." He tilted his head, a playful smile on his lips. "Do you ever do anything just for yourself?" The question caught me off guard. I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out. "I mean it," he continued. "You're always running around, taking care of everyone else. When was the last time you did something just because it made you happy?" I looked down at the box of pasta in my hand, feeling an uncomfortable truth settle over me. "I guess I don't really think about it." "You should," he said softly. Then, as if sensing the weight of the moment, he grinned. "Tell you what, why don't you let me buy you a cup of coffee? My treat." "Coffee?" I repeated, surprised. "Yeah, there's a great little cafe just down the street. No strings, I promise. Just neighbors having a chat." I hesitated. I knew I should say no, but something about the way he looked at me made it impossible. "Okay," I heard myself say. "Just coffee." The cafe was cozy and tucked away, the kind of place I'd passed a dozen times but never stopped to explore. Caleb ordered for us, an Americano for him and a caramel latte for me. We found a table by the window, and for a moment, I felt like I was in a different life. "So," he said, leaning back in his chair, "what's the verdict on the coffee?" I took a sip and smiled. "It's good. Better than what I make at home." See? I told you. We fell into easy conversation, talking about everything and nothing. He told me about his move, how he'd left the city after his divorce to start fresh. I found myself opening up more than I expected, sharing little details about my life with Michael and the kids. You're really devoted to them, Caleb said, his tone thoughtful. They're my world, I replied, though the words felt hollow. And your husband? I hesitated, unsure how to answer. Michael works hard. He's a good provider. That's not what I asked, he said gently. I looked away, unable to meet his eyes. It's complicated. Caleb didn't press me, but the silence that followed felt heavy with understanding. As we finished our coffee, Caleb leaned forward, his expression serious. Emma, I hope you know you deserve to be happy. Really happy. The sincerity in his voice took my breath away. For so long, I'd been moving through life on autopilot, convinced that this was as good as it got. But in that moment, sitting across from Caleb, I felt something stir in me. A spark I hadn't felt in years. I should go, I said, standing abruptly. Of course, he replied, standing as well. I didn't mean to. No, it's fine. I have things to do. I left the cafe with my heart racing, a mix of guilt and exhilaration coursing through me. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about Caleb, his smile, his words, the way he looked at me as if he saw something in me I'd long forgotten. Michael came home late, exhausted and distracted as usual. He kissed me on the cheek and went straight to his office. I sat in the living room, staring at my untouched book, the memory of Caleb's voice echoing in my mind. You deserve to be happy. The following week was a blur of routine, but my thoughts refused to quiet. Caleb's words haunted me. You deserve to be happy. It wasn't just what he said. It was the way he looked at me, like he believed it more than I ever could. By Thursday, I couldn't take it anymore. I found myself outside in the late afternoon, pretending to water the garden but really hoping to catch a glimpse of him. The air was heavy with the scent of rain that had fallen earlier, and the sky was streaked with orange as the sun began to set. Just as I was about to give up and head inside, his voice called out, Hey, Emma. I turned to see him leaning on the fence, his smile easy but his eyes searching mine. Hey, I said, my voice trembling slightly. Busy day? Not really. Just keeping busy. He nodded, stepping closer to the fence. I was about to pour myself a glass of wine. Care to join me? I hesitated, every rational part of me screaming to say no. But the pull was too strong, the need for something for him overwhelming. Just one glass, I said, trying to sound casual. Caleb's house was warm and inviting, with soft lighting and the faint smell of cedar. He poured 2 glasses of red wine and led me to the living room, where a cozy fire crackled in the hearth. You have a beautiful home, I said, sitting on the plush couch. Thanks. It's still a work in progress, but I like it. He sat beside me, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body. We talked for a while, the conversation flowing effortlessly. He asked about my interests, my dreams, the kind of questions Michael hadn't asked in years. I felt seen, heard, in a way I hadn't in so long. You're incredible. You know that? Caleb said suddenly, his voice low. I looked at him, startled. What? You are, Emma. I don't know if anyone's told you that lately, but you are. I felt my cheeks flush, a mix of embarrassment and something deeper. Caleb, He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from my face. His touch was gentle, yet it sent a shiver through me. Emma, if this is too much, just say the word, and I'll stop, he said softly. But I've wanted to do this since the moment I met you. I didn't respond with words. Couldn't. Instead, I leaned forward, and before I could second-guess myself, our lips met. The kiss was tentative at first, but it quickly deepened, his hands tangling in my hair as mine gripped the front of his shirt. The world outside disappeared, leaving only the warmth of his touch and the intoxicating taste of his lips. We stumbled toward his bedroom, a mix of laughter and urgency filling the air. My heart pounded as he guided me to the edge of the bed, his hands sliding down my arms, leaving a trail of fire in their wake. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," I breathed, the word escaping before I could think. What followed was a whirlwind of passion and release. His hands explored every inch of me, as if trying to memorize me, and I let myself get lost in the moment, in him. For the first time in years I felt alive, like I was more than a mother, a wife, a caretaker. Afterward, we lay tangled together, the room filled with the sound of our breathing. Caleb traced lazy circles on my shoulder, his touch soothing. "I don't want you to regret this," he said after a while. I turned to face him, my heart aching with a mix of joy and guilt. "I don't," I said, though I wasn't sure if it was the truth or a lie I desperately wanted to believe. When I finally left, the house was quiet, and the night air was cool against my flushed skin. I slipped inside my own home, the weight of what I'd done settling over me like a heavy blanket. Michael was already asleep, his soft snores filling the room. I stood in the doorway for a long time, staring at him, wondering how I'd gotten here. But even as guilt gnawed at me, a small, treacherous part of me longed to feel Caleb's touch again. The first time with Caleb wasn't the end, it was the beginning. A door had opened that I couldn't close, even as guilt clawed at the edges of my mind. I told myself it would be a one-time thing, a moment of weakness. But by the end of the week, I found myself looking for excuses to see him. It started innocently enough. "Do you have a minute to look at my garden?" I'd ask. Or he'd send a quick text. "Can I borrow your advice again?" Each encounter felt electric, a mix of fear and exhilaration. One afternoon, Caleb stopped by while Michael was at work, the kids still at school. I opened the door to find him standing there with a crooked smile, holding a small box. "What's this?" I asked, stepping aside to let him in. "Cookies," he said, setting the box on the kitchen counter. "I thought you might like them." "You baked?" He laughed. "Not a chance. There's a bakery downtown that makes these incredible chocolate chip cookies. You seemed like a chocolate kind of girl." I smiled, but the gesture felt shaky. His thoughtfulness caught me off guard, as did the warmth in his eyes. "Thank you," I said, my voice soft. He stepped closer, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "You don't have to thank me, Emma." I didn't resist when he leaned in, his lips brushing mine. The kiss deepened, and before I knew it, we were tangled together in the living room, our breaths mingling, his hands exploring as if he couldn't get enough. After that day, our meetings became a routine. Caleb would text when he knew I'd be alone, and I'd find myself drawn to him, unable to say no. "You're beautiful, Emma. Do you even know that? I can't stop thinking about you. You deserve this." His words wrapped around me like a safety net, pulling me deeper into his orbit. One rainy afternoon, I was curled up on Caleb's couch, wearing one of his oversized sweaters while we shared a bottle of wine. "Do you ever think about leaving?" he asked, his tone casual, but his eyes serious. "Leaving?" He hesitated. "Your marriage, your life here, starting fresh." I looked away, the question hitting harder than I expected. "I can't. I have kids, a husband. But are you happy?" I didn't answer. The truth was too complicated, too painful. "You could be," he said softly, reaching for my hand. "With me." His words sent a thrill through me, but they also terrified me. Caleb was becoming more than an escape. He was becoming an option, a temptation I wasn't sure I could resist. The danger of our meetings wasn't just in the secrecy. It was in how easily they fit into my life. I began to look forward to them, to him, in a way that made the rest of my world feel dull by comparison. But the risk was always there, lurking in the background. One evening, as we lay entwined in Caleb's bed, I heard a phone buzz. I reached for it instinctively, thinking it was mine, but the name on the screen froze me. "Michael." Panic surged through me as I realized Caleb had accidentally picked up my phone earlier and placed it on the nightstand. I grabbed it quickly, heart pounding, and saw a message. "Running late. Be home by 9. Relief flooded me, but the reality of what I was doing hit me hard. I was playing with fire, risking everything, my marriage, my family, for these stolen moments. That night, I returned home to find Michael already asleep. I stood by the bed, watching him, guilt settling over me like a heavy blanket. I promised myself it would end, that I wouldn't see Caleb again. But the next day, when his text came through, "I miss you. Can I see you?" I didn't hesitate. By now, Caleb wasn't just a secret. I had built a second life around him. My days were divided between being the wife and mother I was supposed to be and the woman I'd become with him. It was thrilling and terrifying in equal measure, like walking a tightrope with no safety net. But the cracks were starting to show. It began with small things. Michael commented on how distracted I seemed. "You've been forgetting things lately," he said one evening as I struggled to remember where I'd put my car keys. "I'm just tired," I replied, avoiding his gaze. He nodded but didn't look convinced. Then there were the moments of near discovery. Caleb's cologne lingering on my clothes, a stray text message I'd almost forgotten to delete, the way my phone buzzed just a little too often. The real trouble started when Caleb's behavior changed. One afternoon, he showed up at my house unannounced. I had told him to text first, to make sure the coast was clear, but there he was, standing on my porch with that disarming smile. "What are you doing here?" I hissed, glancing over my shoulder to make sure no one was around. "I wanted to see you," he said, stepping inside. "I missed you. Caleb, we talked about this. You can't just..." He silenced me with a kiss, his hands gripping my waist. For a moment, I forgot my frustration, melting into him. But as I pulled away, reality crashed back in. "You can't keep doing this," I said, my voice trembling. "It's too risky." "You're worth the risk," he said, his eyes intense. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to believe him, but another part knew we were playing with fire. The turning point came a week later. I was at the grocery store, filling my cart with the usual essentials, when I saw her, Marcy, the nosy neighbor who seemed to know everyone's business. She was standing a few aisles away, staring at me with a curious expression. "Emma," she said as she approached. "Fancy running into you here." "Hi, Marcy," I replied, forcing a smile. We made small talk for a few minutes, but I could feel her eyes studying me, as if she knew something was off. "By the way," she said, her tone casual, "I saw Caleb leaving your house the other day. I didn't realize you two were such good friends." My heart stopped. "Oh, he was just borrowing something," I said quickly, my voice a little too high. Marcy's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Of course. I just thought it was interesting. He's such a charming man, isn't he?" I laughed nervously and made an excuse to leave, but the encounter left me rattled. Marcy wasn't just nosy. She was relentless. And if she suspected anything, it wouldn't take long for the whole neighborhood to know. That night, I confronted Caleb. "You have to be more careful," I said as we sat on his couch, a glass of wine untouched in my hand. "Marcy saw you leaving my house." "So what?" he said, leaning back, completely unbothered. "So what? Caleb, she's the biggest gossip on the block. If she starts talking..." "Let her talk," he interrupted. "What's the worst that could happen? Michael finds out." His words hit like a slap. "You don't understand. If he finds out, I could lose everything." "And what about me?" Caleb asked, his voice rising. "I've put everything on the line for you, Emma. Don't act like I'm the only one with something to lose." The tension between us was suffocating. For the first time, I saw a side of Caleb that scared me. A possessiveness that felt more like control than passion. The breaking point came a few days later. I received a text from an unknown number. "I know what you've been up to. Meet me at the park tomorrow or everyone else will know too." Panic surged through me. I didn't recognize the number, but the implication was clear. Someone had seen us. When I showed Caleb the message, he was furious. "It's probably just some prank," he said. "What if it's not?" I demanded. "What if someone knows?" "Then we deal with it," he said, his tone dark. The next day, I went to the park as instructed, my heart pounding. A figure emerged from the shadows, Marcy. Well, she said, her smile sharp. "I had my suspicions, but seeing it in person, that's something else." What do you want? I asked, my voice shaking. Relax, Emma. I'm not going to tell anyone. Yet. But secrets like these, they come with a price. What kind of price? Let's just say you'll owe me some favors. And if I ever need something, you'll make sure I get it. Her words felt like a noose tightening around my neck. I nodded, my mind racing. Fine. Just don't say anything. Good girl, she said, turning to leave. As I stood there, trembling, I realized I wasn't just trapped between Caleb and Michael anymore. Now, Marcy held the keys to my secret, and I had no idea what she would do with them. The days after Marcy's veiled threat were unbearable. Every time I saw her, whether it was walking her dog or chatting with neighbors, my heart raced. Was she going to tell someone? Would she expose me? But what I didn't know was that the revelation wasn't going to come from her. It was a quiet Sunday morning when my world began to unravel. Michael had taken the kids to an early soccer game, leaving me with a rare few hours of solitude. I used the time to clean, wiping down counters and straightening up the living room. That's when I saw it. My phone, sitting on the edge of the coffee table, buzzing with a new message. I grabbed it absent-mindedly, expecting a group text or an update from Michael. But the message wasn't from anyone I recognized. It was from Caleb. Can't stop thinking about you. Yesterday was amazing. I need to see you again soon. My blood turned to ice. Emma! Michael's voice startled me. I spun around to find him standing in the doorway, holding his phone in his hand. His expression was a mixture of confusion and anger. You forgot to take your phone off the kids' app. The notifications sync, he said, his tone low and clipped. I stared at him, my breath caught in my throat. My mind scrambled for an explanation, but none came. What is this? He demanded, holding up his phone and reading Caleb's message aloud. Michael, I can explain. I began, but the words sounded weak even to me. Explain. His voice rose. Explain what? That you've been sneaking around behind my back? With the neighbor. I flinched, unable to meet his eyes. It's not what it looks like, I said desperately. Don't insult me, Emma. His voice cracked, and for the first time, I saw the hurt beneath his anger. How long has this been going on? I opened my mouth to answer, but the sound of a knock at the door cut me off. Michael shot me a look, his face dark with suspicion. Expecting someone? No, I whispered, dread pooling in my stomach. He marched to the door and swung it open. Standing on the porch was Caleb. Michael, Caleb said, his voice even. He glanced at me, his expression unreadable. Can we talk? You've got some nerve showing up here, Michael said, his fists clenching. Get off my property. Not until we talk, Caleb replied, stepping forward. Michael turned to me, his voice shaking with fury. Is this what you've been doing while I'm working my ass off for this family? Screwing the neighbor. Michael, please, I said, tears streaming down my face. You don't get to please me right now, he snapped, his voice cutting through the air like a whip. Caleb cleared his throat, drawing Michael's attention back to him. Emma isn't happy, Michael, and I think you know that. For a moment, the room went silent. Then Michael let out a bitter laugh. You think you can walk in here and tell me what my wife wants? You don't know a damn thing about us. I know she deserves better, Caleb said evenly. Michael took a step forward, his face inches from Caleb's. You think you're better? You're just some loser playing house in the suburbs. Get out before I call the police. Stop it, I shouted, my voice cracking. Both men turned to me, their anger palpable. This isn't solving anything, I said, my voice trembling. Michael, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for this to happen. You didn't mean for this to happen? He repeated, his voice dripping with disbelief. You've destroyed our family, Emma. And for what? Him. The silence that followed was deafening. Caleb stood frozen, his face pale. Michael's chest heaved with anger. His eyes locked on me as if trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Finally, Michael grabbed his keys. I'm taking the kids to my mother's, he said flatly. I'll be back to talk about what happens next. Don't be here when I get home. He turned and walked out, slamming the door behind him. I stood there, my legs shaking, as Caleb reached for me. "Emma, don't," I said, stepping back. "You shouldn't have come here. I couldn't let him treat you like that," he said, his voice soft. "This isn't your fight," I said, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. "I made a mistake, Caleb. I can't do this anymore." He looked at me, hurt flashing across his face. "You don't mean that." "I do," I said, my voice firm. "This has to end." As the door closed behind Caleb, I collapsed onto the couch, the weight of everything crushing down on me. My marriage was in ruins, my family broken, and the man I thought had given me freedom now felt like a chain I couldn't escape. And worst of all, I had no one to blame but myself. The house was suffocatingly quiet after Michael and the kids left. Every sound, the creak of the floor, the hum of the refrigerator, seemed amplified in the emptiness. I sat on the couch for what felt like hours, replaying the confrontation in my head, trying to make sense of how everything had spiraled so far out of control. I knew what I had to do. The next day, Caleb called and texted relentlessly, but I didn't respond. When he showed up at the house, knocking insistently, I didn't answer. I couldn't face him, not yet, but I couldn't avoid him forever. By the third day, he managed to catch me leaving the grocery store. I was halfway to my car when I heard his voice. "Emma, wait." I stopped, my heart pounding as I turned to face him. He looked disheveled, his usually calm demeanor replaced with something desperate. "We need to talk," he said. "There's nothing left to say, Caleb," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "That's not true," he insisted, stepping closer. "You can't just end this. Not like this." I sighed, clutching the bag of groceries in my hands. "It was a mistake. I was selfish and I hurt people I care about. This has to stop." His jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought he was going to argue. Instead, he said, "Do you care about me at all? Or was I just some escape for you?" His words hit harder than I expected. "It wasn't like that," I said quietly. "But this, whatever we had, it's not worth losing my family." "I don't believe you," he said, his voice low. "Caleb, please," I said, tears stinging my eyes. "Let me fix what I can." He stared at me for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he nodded, his movements stiff and resigned. "Fine, if that's what you want." I thought it was over after that, but Caleb wasn't done. The first sign of trouble came a week later. Michael had returned home, and we were in the midst of painfully awkward coexistence. Barely speaking, our interactions limited to logistical details about the kids and the house. One afternoon, I came home from running errands to find a package on the doorstep. It was unmarked, with no return address. Curious, I brought it inside and opened it. Inside was a small stack of photos. Me and Caleb, laughing together in his backyard, holding hands in the park, and the most damning, a shot of us kissing in his living room. My blood ran cold as I sifted through the images. At the bottom of the stack was a note. "This isn't over." That evening, I called Caleb, my hands shaking as I gripped the phone. "What the hell is this?" I demanded when he answered. "What's what?" he replied, his tone calm, almost mocking. "The photos," I snapped. "The note. Are you trying to blackmail me?" There was a long pause before he said, "I didn't send you anything, Emma." "Then who did?" "I don't know," he said, his voice darkening. "But if someone has those photos, they're playing both of us." I wanted to believe him, but doubt gnawed at me. The truth came out 2 days later. Marcy showed up at my door, her ever-present smug smile firmly in place. "Emma," she said sweetly, holding up her phone. "I just thought you'd like to know that Caleb isn't who you think he is." "What are you talking about?" I asked, dread pooling in my stomach. "Let's just say he has a habit of getting too close to women in situations like yours." I stared at her, my mind racing. "What do you mean?" "He's a predator," she said bluntly. "I heard from someone in the neighborhood where he lived before. He did the same thing to another woman. Got involved, made her think she was special, then used her to get back at her husband." "Sound familiar?" "No," I whispered, shaking my head. Marcy smiled, her eyes cold. Oh yes, and now he's trying to cover his tracks by making sure you're the one who gets burned. That night, I confronted Caleb for the last time. You lied to me, I said, my voice shaking with anger. What are you talking about? He asked, his expression carefully neutral. You manipulated me. You've done this before. You used me to get back at Michael, didn't you? He didn't deny it. Instead, he smiled. A slow, chilling smile that made my blood run cold. You were an easy target, Emma. Lonely, dissatisfied, desperate for someone to make you feel alive. I gave you what you wanted. You're sick? I spat, stepping back. And you're a hypocrite, he replied smoothly. You knew exactly what you were doing. I turned and walked away, ignoring his voice calling after me. That night, I told Michael everything. I didn't sugarcoat it, didn't try to defend myself. He listened in silence, his face unreadable. When I was finished, he stood and said, I'll have the divorce papers drawn up. I nodded, tears streaming down my face. I had lost everything. My husband, my lover, my family. And I had no one to blame but myself. The days leading up to the divorce proceedings were a blur. Michael moved into the guest room, his silence louder than any argument we could have had. He avoided me whenever possible, communicating only when necessary and always about the children. The kids, of course, sensed the tension. Our youngest, Sophie, asked me one night, Mommy, why isn't Daddy sleeping in your room anymore? I fumbled for an answer, forcing a smile. Sometimes grown-ups need space, sweetheart. It doesn't mean we don't love you. Her big, questioning eyes told me she wasn't convinced, but she nodded anyway. Michael's lawyer was swift and brutal. The papers arrived within days, a stark reminder of how little there was left to salvage. The terms were clear: joint custody of the kids, with Michael seeking primary physical custody, citing my unstable behavior as a factor. I had no choice but to agree. Fighting back would mean dragging the kids through an ugly legal battle and exposing details I wanted to keep buried. The hearing came faster than I expected. I walked into the courthouse that morning, my stomach churning, my hands trembling. Michael was already there, sitting with his lawyer. He didn't look at me when I entered, but his posture was rigid, his jaw tight. The proceedings were clinical, devoid of the intimacy that had once defined our lives together. Michael's lawyer presented evidence, a timeline pieced together from receipts, texts, and photos. Each item felt like a dagger to my heart, but the worst was seeing Michael's face as they were laid out. The pain in his eyes, barely masked by his anger, was almost unbearable. The real blow came when Caleb was called to testify. I hadn't expected it. I thought he'd want to stay far away from the chaos, but there he was, walking into the courtroom with that same disarming confidence. Mr. Rhodes, Michael's lawyer began, you had a relationship with Mrs. Davis, correct? Yes, Caleb replied, his voice steady. And during that time, did she confide in you about her marriage? She did, he said, glancing briefly in my direction. She told me she felt neglected, unappreciated. She was unhappy. The lawyer pressed on. Did you encourage her to leave her husband? Caleb hesitated, then nodded. I did. I thought she deserved better. I clenched my fists, my heart pounding. He wasn't lying, but hearing it laid out so plainly, so coldly, made it all feel worse. And did you end the relationship? The lawyer asked. No, Caleb said, his voice soft. She did. Why? She realized what she stood to lose, he replied, his eyes meeting mine for a fleeting moment. The judge ruled in Michael's favor, granting him primary custody of the kids. I would have visitation rights, but the message was clear: I had failed them. As I left the courtroom that day, I felt like a ghost of myself. The life I'd built, the family I cherished, was gone. The weeks that followed were the hardest. The house felt empty without the kids, their laughter replaced by a suffocating silence. I spent my days cleaning rooms that didn't need cleaning, organizing closets I'd already organized 100 times. Michael was cordial but distant when we exchanged the kids for visitation. He didn't say much, but the way he avoided my eyes spoke volumes. Caleb, too, was gone. He moved out of the neighborhood shortly after the trial, leaving no forwarding address. Part of me was relieved, but another part, a small, shameful part, missed him. One evening, as I sat in the empty house, a glass of wine in my hand, I finally allowed myself to cry. For everything I'd lost, for the people I'd hurt, and for the woman I'd become. I didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear. I would have to rebuild from the ground up. And this time I would do it alone. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments, and do not forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel.